You're watching Beyond Markets, where we bring you up to speed on development outcomes in Africa. I'm Kenneth Igbomor, and welcome and thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Coming up, we're looking at how Africa can build capacity against shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can join the conversation on social media. Let us know what you think about what we discussed. The handle is at CNBC Africa. You can also use the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can hit me up at my handle. That's at Kenneth Igbomor. Now, the African Capacity Building Foundation is the African Union's specialized agency for capacity development. The Executive Secretary of the Foundation, Emmanuel Nnadozie, joins me now to explore ways the continent can build capacity to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, sir. And I'd like to start first with your assessment of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it affects Africa's development trajectory.
Yes, thank you for having me. The COVID-19 pandemic is a major crisis for Africa, for the African continent. But for us to better understand the economic impact, we need to see the three dimensions of this pandemic. First is the impact of the pandemic itself, or the disease itself, on communities, individuals, nations, and and regions. The second is to see the economic and social impact of the response to the pandemic and the mitigation measures that have been put in place. And third is the challenge of post-COVID-19 recovery and reconstruction when this disease goes away. So according to various estimates, the pandemic will have a severe impact on the economies of African countries. And the estimates that the ADB has come up with will be about 22 billion up to $88 billion of loss of gross domestic product. So this is a very serious challenge for the continent because it does have direct impact on economic activity and productive capacity through infections and death. It does have disruption in trade and value chains that we have seen because there's a sharp decline in the prices of primary commodities. Every oil exporter in Africa now is facing serious, budgetary challenges because of the reduction in price of oil and the demand for oil, which means a reduction in export of these primary commodities. There's also decline in financial flow in terms of remittances, in terms of investments, foreign aid, and tourism that has also been hit hard because of the travel ban and the lockdown. Finally, there are also disruptions due to the containment. Yes.
All right, but how does it impact the work that you're doing at the Africa Capacity Foundation over the years, and what role are you playing to help mitigate the impact on the continent?
Well, as an organization, we are also affected directly through our lockdown. So we're no longer able to function at full capacity. But it affects our ability to support the countries and the member states, our non-state actors, and all the institutions, both at the country level, at the regional level, and at the continental level, where we build capacity of institutions and provide the critical technical skills that are needed to bring about economic transformation in Africa. So our work is seriously affected by this pandemic. But notwithstanding, ACDF, as you know, is over the last almost 30 years, have been helping countries to set up the key institutions that will help them to bring about development and to strengthen the existing ones. It has also been helping to train thousands and thousands of those in science, technology, engineering, and in economic policy management, which are the critical technical skills that are needed. But it's also been helping to strengthen systems and provide capacity for policy design, policy implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. So these are the sort of things that we are doing, but we're finding innovative ways of building this capacity in the absence of going to deliver them physically on the ground.
All right, but still looking at the role of the Africa Capacity Building Foundation, I understand that the Board of Governors met just in February, and I would like to know what were the key takeaways from that engagement and how this situation, the COVID-19 pandemic situation here, is affecting how you're re-strategizing or more or less changing your focus.
Yes, we were supposed to actually meet in March in Accra, Ghana, but because of the travel ban and the impact of COVID-19, the meeting was postponed. But notwithstanding, we were sharing experiences with our Board of Governors, who are mostly the ministers of finance or planning, depending on the country, that give us the general orientation and the work that we need to be doing to support their work in the countries. And the main issue that was on the table during this meeting was on the issue of the fourth industrial revolution and how to make sure that Africa is not left behind in this technological advancement that is happening across the world. And for us, this requires a couple of things. The first is to make sure that we have the digital capacity to be able to participate effectively in this fourth industrial revolution, which means that our program on building digital capacity for Africa is now more essential, especially in this pandemic period where you can see that digitalization has become a key thing that will assist every dimension of the fight against this disease. The second thing was looking at the job market, especially for young people, the youth who, as you know, are heavily affected by severe unemployment, which are considered to be the most important challenge facing Africa, along with this COVID-19. What kinds of, how do we retool and build the skills of these young people to be able to participate in this new economy and in this fourth industrial revolution, given the fact that they are the ones who are supposed to be driving the economic transformation of the continent? So the skill sets that are there, those were the things we were discussing, the jobs for the future, how do we build those capacities and build those skills and empower both the young people and women so that they can be able to fully participate in this new economy that we're discussing.
But looking at how things are playing out, though, with lockdowns and the implications on economies across the continent, though, I'd like to get your assessment on how you see the level of fiscal and monetary response we've seen from governments across Africa, and what level, sort of stimulus packages that they've been putting together, and how best this can be better coordinated.
Yes, that's a very important question. As you know, the pandemic has generated a supply shock and a demand shock in African economies. And once you have these two shocks at the same time, it becomes very difficult. And I would not like to be in the position of many finance ministers or central bank governors at this point in time, because they got their hands full. On the supply side, there's going to be increased unemployment due to the pandemic and the response to the pandemic, and decrease in output, which is a reduction in economic growth. And on the demand side, there's a reduced demand for goods and services. So overall, the policies that can be put in place would have to be viewing these things from this lens, as well as from the lens of the direct impact of the disease, the impact of the response to the disease, and then, of course, what happens when the disease is over. So as far as monetary policy is concerned, my thinking is that this is a time to begin to think seriously about the expansionary policies, which will include even quantitative easing, expansionary policies that will help to provide liquidity in the economy and supply resources to the financial sector, including banks, but also to think about social protection programs for those who are vulnerable and those who have been seriously affected by the disease. There will also be need to really think about sensible exchange rate policies and for central banks to move away from the narrow inflation targeting that many of them have been doing to actually focus on growth and employment as well. On the fiscal side, of course, the number one thing to do is to seize the opportunity and invest in public health systems, which many countries have ignored for years. This is expansionary, making sure that saving lives is the most important thing, providing the equipment that's needed to treat the disease, but also dealing with the vulnerable as well, so that you can protect livelihoods. And then have targeted support for businesses, especially the small and medium enterprises, and to put in place overall stimulus packages and improve the trade policy to allow things to happen. So many countries are already doing well in terms of these stimulus packages or in terms of putting together policies. But as you rightly pointed out, the capacity sometimes to deliver and implement is a challenge. And this is where ACBF comes in, is willing to support countries to accelerate their delivery and capacity, implementation capacity to be able to actually get the results that they want in these particular stimulus packages. Then coordination is also very important. There has to be better coordination, interdepartmental or interministerial coordination, coordination at different levels of government, whether it is to a subnational level and the national level, even regionally speaking. So that there's some, because without coordination, since this is a global challenge, it will require global coordination to be able to solve the problem. And last but not the least is that the debt issue has to be dealt with now. I think Africa must speak with one voice about dealing with debt, because they would have to incur more deficits to be able to address this problem. So dealing with the existing debt levels that are already high, including debt restructuring or even debt cancellation, is something that I believe that they have to take as a matter of priority and urgency.
Interesting points you put out there, and it also speaks to the importance of building a more resilient economies and even the healthcare system, because if you know, it's just a decade until the SDGs targets are going to be met. But looking at how this can be done, though, how best can we achieve these resilient economies and making sure that no country is left behind?
Yes, again, very important points. You know that there's a saying that you should never allow a crisis to go to waste. And I believe that even though this pandemic is a major crisis for the continent, it presents also an opportunity to do the things that countries have not done. They have the Abuja agreement of investing a certain percentage of public expenditure in health. But health systems across the country are in really bad shape. So this provides an opportunity both to deal with the short-term issue of the disease, controlling the disease and preventing the spread and loss of life, but at the same time to restructure the budgets and rechannel resources in the public health system to be able to strengthen them for the long run. But more importantly, there is no other policy that's better than having better economic management and debt sustainability, but also restructuring the economy. African countries have often talked about the need for economic transformation, but both the critical skills and the infrastructure needed for this to happen are still not there, not in place. So this is also an opportunity to say, because diversification of the economy will bring about more resilience, so that countries do not just depend on export of oil. When the price crashes as it had done, you've seen that countries that budgeted for $70 a barrel are now finding the prices have been below $20 a barrel, sometimes even negative. And that has severe impact on the ability to provide services for the people and make social investments that are necessary in human capital development and in institutional development.
All right, thank you. I need to hold that thought, Emmanuel, for a second. Then we'll just take a quick break, and when we return, definitely we'll continue our conversation on how to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and build that capacity that Africa desperately needs for its development. Welcome back to Beyond Markets. If you're just joining me, we've been speaking to the Executive Secretary of the Africa Capacity Building Foundation in person of Emmanuel Nnadozie, and he's been giving some very interesting insight. But Emmanuel, I'd like to take you to another point, which is I'm very passionate about, and it's, talking about that need for international collaboration here. I'd like to get your assessment of the level of support we're seeing from the international community.
Well, so far, Africa will need huge amounts of resources. That will probably be more than $100 billion to be able to tackle it, according to the estimates that have been put out there. And if there's any time where there is need for global solidarity and global coordination of support, I think this is the time, because this is a disease that is global in nature and require globally coordinated effort. And so far, we've seen the multilaterals from the African Development Bank, the IMF, and the World Bank come out with strong pronouncements of huge amounts of resources that they're willing to commit, especially to Africa, to support the country. But we expect also, given the fact that many African countries do not have the resources nor the space, the fiscal space to be able to actually run large deficits, to be able to handle this problem. So it is now important for the partners overseas, bilateral partners and others, including the private foundations, to come out and strongly support the efforts that are being made already in the continent. We've seen that following the examples of the multilateral institutions, we have had some foundations, we've also had some other bilateral partners coming to the table. But because many of these countries also are facing their own challenges, one begins to worry that some of the pledges made may not come out to become fulfilled in a concrete and tangible manner. But that notwithstanding, one area that the countries can support Africa is those countries that are to whom Africa is indebted should seriously consider some measures that will either reduce the debt or cancel the debt altogether, to provide some room for African countries to channel those resources that they would have used to be paying interest on the debt or paying the debt itself to fighting the coronavirus and the impact of the disease on their economies.
All right, Emmanuel, but you see quite a lot of work being done here, talking about the role of international partners, even development finance institutions. But I would like you to speak on, what the private sector here can do. We're seeing quite a lot of support here from the private sector in Nigeria. I would like you to get your thoughts on how you should see this play out across the continent.
Yes, well, of course, the private sector is a key player in this fight against COVID-19 pandemic. But one should also recognize that the private sector has also been hit hard by the disease itself, the impact of the disease, as well as the mitigation measures that have been put in place, to prevent the spread of the disease. So, but having said that, it is encouraging that some of the big private sector operators are coming out and bringing out their wallets and making donations to support the efforts that governments are making. This is needed. And like I said, the amount of effort and resources needed to fight this disease is so significant that every sector of the community and society would have to play their role, because people have lost their livelihoods and their jobs, and also people have lost their lives, and the disease has to be contained and controlled. And so the resources are huge. So the private sector has a big role to play. I don't believe that they have fulfilled that role in the way it should be, because I believe they still have the capacity to do more than they're doing, not only just by providing funding, but also by making sure that they rechannel, in many cases, their productive capacity towards bringing the things out that will be needed to fight the disease or to support the vulnerable people in improving their lives. So I think the private sector will have a big role to play. Examples that I've shown, as you mentioned, in Nigeria, where quite a few of the billionaires have come out to support government efforts. But let me also highlight at the same point that getting resources is one thing, mobilizing those resources is one thing, but effectively and transparently managing those resources to ensure that they are used in a transparent and fiduciary manner is a different matter altogether. Again, we as ACDF, we insist on making sure that we fight corruption, but also to enhance and strengthen financial control systems to ensure that whatever funds that are being used are used in a prudent manner for the purposes they were intended.
All right, Emmanuel, it's one thing to get all the support from all the partners, from international partners, from development finance institutions, even from the private sector. But like you brightly mentioned, the implementation of it is also key and very important in all of this. But I'd like you to speak to one other issue, which I think is also very pertinent, is has Africa articulated what it wants or the kind of support it needs to come out of this crisis?
Yes, I believe Africa has, because because there is no more movement. So sometimes people think that nothing is happening. We have been, for example, from a capacity standpoint, we have been in touch with our stakeholders, including member states, on what their needs will be, and many of them have seriously articulated these needs. And we are working with our own partners to see how we can support them. I know that there's an ongoing discussion by member states with the African Development Bank, with the World Bank and IMF, and even with the European Union, and the efforts being put together through the coordination of the African Union to really coordinate better these discussions, so to help in articulating the needs of African countries. Yes, the countries have, but of course one would say how well informed are these needs that are being said, or how well organized is the ability to really deliver, to present these needs in a way that is coherent and comprehensive, and not just simply in a piecemeal fashion. But again, these are some of the challenges that some countries are facing. For example, if you look at what the issues are, you see that countries, they need capacity for testing and detection, treatment and critical care, mobilizing and managing resources, managing the economy and protecting the poor and the vulnerable, and even in communication and building awareness. And so these are being articulated with the support of the African Centers for Disease Control and the WHO. I think also from the health standpoint, the health ministers of African countries have been discussing together to really articulate what they need. But as you know, the need goes beyond just the health dimension, goes to social and economic development issues. And these are being handled as well by the respective ministers with their partners, including ACBS.
All right, Emmanuel, I'd like to get your views on the amount of work that needs to be done, especially in mobilizing the expertise that is needed in terms of human capital, to address the challenges that we're facing here with this. We've seen that on one hand there's the health crisis, on the other hand there's also the economic crisis as well. How are we working to get that level of human capacity, even from the frontline health workers, even to economic thinkers who can get us, out of this without, hitting the continent very badly?
Yes. One of the major issues that this pandemic has, lessons that it has provided for Africa, is the dangers of not investing in human capital and in your institutions and in physical capital. And human capital, as you know, human capital development is mostly health and education. Of course, it goes beyond that with social capital and so on and so forth. But if you neglect the investment in health and education, that is build human capital, it will be difficult for you to become a developed country or transform your economy in a way that will provide the sort of resiliency and stability and economic development that you intend to achieve. So the lesson here is, as ACBF has been highlighting, we did an assessment of the capacity needed to achieve Agenda 2063, including its first 10-year plan. And we showed the seriousness of the lack of the gaps or the lack of critical skills that are needed for transformation to happen. Thousands and thousands of engineers needed. Now we have seen that medical doctors are needed everywhere, nurses, first responders, all the healthcare workers are needed, and they're in huge shortage everywhere in the country. So investment in these capacities is now more important than ever. But beyond the investment in this human capital, the retention of this human capital so that it is retained in the continent is even far more important. And the utilization of this human capital is also extremely important, because we find situations where African countries are now subsidizing the West through spending their little resources in training nurses and doctors only for them to emigrate to Europe or to North America, who do not need those kinds of subsidies. And so capacity retention and capacity utilization policies and strategies that ACBF has developed are things that can help countries to minimize this problem and to ensure that they put in the maximum investment necessary. But I must say that it is also lamentable that even though everybody recognizes that capacity is a missing piece of the central point, people just talk about it. If you look at the investment in capacity development over the years, one would expect that given the enormity of the challenge, that the funding should be going high. No, ACBF, the demand for our services are so huge that our ability to really deal with it is limited because of the, number one, the insufficiency of the funding, number two, the unpredictability of the funding, and number three, the unsustainability of the funding. So these are issues that our partners and member states should have to keep in mind, that if you really want to address this problem, you need to support the organizations who are in the front line of dealing with this challenge and invest in your people. That's the best investment you can ever make.
All right, then investing in people is the best investment according to Emmanuel Nnadozie. He's the Executive Secretary of the Africa Capacity Building Foundation. And that's all on Beyond Markets for today. And thank you so much for being a part of the show. Remember, you can watch all episodes of the show on our website. That's at CNBC Africa. And the show airs at 5 p.m. daily in West Africa time. And that's it on the show. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.